Hello, welcome to the France 24 interview. Our guest today is Mark Gewisser, who is a South African writer and the author of a biography of the former South African President Thabo Mbeki. Mr. Gewisser, welcome to the France 24 interview.
Good to be here.
So 20 years ago, the last apartheid era laws were officially abrogated. First of all, is this something that's being celebrated in South Africa?
Not at all. It's very interesting. The apartheid ended over a very long period of time. It began to end in the late 1980s when black people just started disobeying the law, looking for places to live closer to town. And the state lost its will to police apartheid laws. It then the date that's celebrated as the end of apartheid in South Africa is February the 2nd, 1990, which was the date that F.W. de Klerk announced that he was going to release Nelson Mandela and unban the liberation movements. And then between February the 2nd, 1990 and the elections, which were 4 years later, on April the 27th, 1994, there were 4 years of transition during which apartheid ended slowly, but there are many people who believe that apartheid hasn't ended, and there's just reason to say that too. So it's an ongoing discussion as to whether apartheid is over.
Right, because there are some people who might not celebrate because they believe apartheid has not totally disappeared, or that post-apartheid is a disappointment.
There's no question that on many measures, South Africa, apartheid is over, in my opinion. There is a functional democracy, even though it is dominated by the former liberation movement, the African National Congress. There has also been a major extension of services, ranging from education and health to housing and electricity, roads, etc. But South Africa remains a highly unequal society. 48% of South Africans exist on less than $2 a day, and those are all black people. It has a very high Gini coefficient. In other words, the inequality between rich and poor people is growing. And many people have not benefited adequately from the rollout of services like education. There's also an unemployment crisis in South Africa, so that the majority of young people don't work. And all of those are indicators of a society that has not yet transformed, even though legal apartheid is over and everybody has the vote.
Is there a risk that South Africa follows the Zimbabwean road, whereas the regime there's a crisis, economic crisis, political crisis, or do you think democracy is sound enough in South Africa?
I really don't think there's a possibility that South Africa will follow the Zimbabwe route for several reasons. Firstly, South Africa has a large and highly developed and very sophisticated civil society, media, independent judiciary, a corporate sector. Because of South Africa's placement in the global economy, South Africa matters to the world and the world matters to South Africa in a way that Zimbabwe, which is a sort of single crop economy, tobacco, doesn't. Another really important aspect of South African history is that because of the discovery of gold and diamonds in the late 19th century, South Africa industrialized very quickly and far more quickly than other African countries, as a result of which there's always been an urban proletariat in South Africa. With an urban proletariat comes a high level of political consciousness, comes a political consciousness linked to notions of modernity that come out of communism and socialism, but also comes a consciousness that's somewhat decoupled from ethnic politics. So what's happened in Zimbabwe is that the majority of Zimbabweans who are members of the Shona tribe have followed Mugabe because he's their man, regardless of whether it's in their best interest to do so or not. Such a situation would not happen in South Africa because ethnic politics, even though it is a multi-ethnic society, ethnic politics don't play in the same way in South Africa as they might in Zimbabwe.
But are they today worrying racial tensions? There is this myth around the Rainbow Nation, Nelson Mandela's legacy, and so on. Some people say that the reality is much more somber.
Here's what I think. If you, Bishop Tutu came up with the expression of the Rainbow Nation. When you speak about a Rainbow Nation, you imagine that there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. When you speak about the Mandela miracle, you imagine a kind of fairy tale ending for a country. And this is an imagination that South Africans had for themselves, but that the world also had for South Africa. So much of the world's aspirations, particularly given how strong the anti-apartheid movement was in the latter part of the 20th century, were around the liberation of black South Africans. And Mandela himself carried this, I think, huge load for the world, that he was going to show some kind of moral reassertion in a century and in a society that had seen so much death and destruction in Africa and elsewhere. And I think what's happened in South Africa is a realization that there is no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, that there is no happy ending for any story of a country. There is just a rocky road that needs to be traveled in a difficult neighborhood. And my sense is that even though there are definite danger signs in South Africa, most South Africans accept that. One marker of that would be the fact that there have recently been local government elections in South Africa, and the voter turnout was higher than ever. So South Africa is not becoming a kind of alienated democracy where people don't think they have a say. The election was also entirely peaceful, even though for the first time there was serious opposition to the ruling African National Congress in its own constituency. The election was peaceful. Now, that doesn't mean the African National Congress behaved impeccably, because ruling parties tend to amass power and abuse it a little bit. So Jacob Zuma, the president of South Africa and the leader of the African National Congress, told voters that their ancestors would turn in their graves if they didn't vote for the ANC, and that if they didn't vote for the ANC, it might hasten Nelson Mandela's demise. That's not particularly democratic.
Are you
discourse.
worried about him?
Am I worried about?
Jacob Zuma's democratic leaning. Some people are.
I am personally worried about Jacob Zuma's commitment to democracy, but I'm not worried about the African National Congress's commitment to democracy. And the lesson is what happened to Thabo Mbeki, Jacob Zuma's predecessor, who in 2007 wanted to remain on as the leader of the African National Congress, even though he had finished his 2 terms as president of the country. And there's a constitutional limit on how long you can be president of the country on. And the African National Congress fired him, because the African National Congress itself, through democratic vote within the party, the African National Congress itself has a very strong and deep tradition of democracy and accountability.
I want to ask about a young leader, the leader of the youth wing of the ANC, Julius Malema, who has become rather well-known and controversial in South Africa because of some declarations he made. He, according to opposition party leader Helen Zille, is threatening the legacy of Nelson Mandela, this post-apartheid Africa, South Africa.
I would absolutely agree with Helen Zille on that score. Julius Malema is the very popular head of the ANC Youth League. He is a demagogic populist of I think, the worst order. He, for example, at the moment is mounting a kind of knee-jerk campaign calling for the nationalization of South African mines, which would be absolutely catastrophic for the South African economy. And because many South Africans feel they're not yet sitting at the banquet of victory, they have not yet benefited enough from the post-apartheid era, he has some support.
But this would be a social measure. Some people have issue because they believe he has a racist, some may say, agenda.
You know, in South Africa, I'm not certain if you can divide the social and the racial.
Okay.
In a society where all the rich people were white and all the poor people were black, and in a society which was kind of perverted by apartheid, I think the social and the racial is the same. Part of Malema's demagogic populism is telling the people what he thinks they want to hear, and it means using a particularly crude political discourse, and a political discourse which is particularly aggressive towards white people and towards black people who are not in the ANC. So, for example, Helen Zille, the politician you mentioned, has a deputy, a black woman, who is one of, I think, South Africa's most interesting young politicians. And Julius Malema publicly called her a tea girl, you know, a maid, a house nigger. I mean, he used the word tea girl, but you could say a maid or a house nigger, which is very offensive language, and which diminishes the level of political discourse in South Africa. South Africa is a democracy where freedom of expression is very important. South Africa has a great constitutional democracy, and I don't think there's any move to silence Julius Malema. And I personally trust that the organs of both civil society and the ANC itself as a broad church is bigger than Julius Malema. So I don't have any particular fears at the moment that Julius Malema is going to lead South Africa along a path of destruction. But I think one needs to be very cautious about it.
Mark Wisser, thank you very much for coming on the France 24 interview. Thank you all for watching it. Stay tuned here on France 24 for more news.